faces. What I want to do today is talk to you about two very related topics. The first, as an economist, I want to tell you a story about a people. I'm going to tell you this story with numbers. We see what actually has transpired largely from the demographic and economic record. And then I want to take that knowledge and talk about Massachusetts in particular. But Massachusetts is a reflection of New England, of the changes that are happening across this region of the country. And I want to link that to the importance of our Latinx communities, and particularly Puerto Ricans in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So let me begin by saying one thing that all the data shows about Puerto Ricans is we move a lot. We party a lot too. We move more than any other racial or ethnic group in this nation. We are continuously on the move, and I want to talk a little bit historically of those periods of really mass movement among Puerto Ricans. And the one we know best is the one that many of us grew up with, whose parents were part of the Great Migration. It's important to note that the Great Migration was not simply a voluntary exercise on the part of Puerto Ricans to get up and try to find a location with better conditions. The Great Migration was really a displacement of largely a rural labor force to largely an urban labor force in New York City. And the numbers of, and I'll show you some of the data that support the numbers, so I'll talk a little bit about the massive flow of people. The Great Migration among Puerto Ricans was one of the largest in recorded history. 25% of the Puerto Rican population got up and left in a relatively short period of time, 2 to 3 decades. Then I'll talk about the 1970s, because in the 1970s, the period, particularly for Puerto Ricans in the United States, it's a period of what I call the Great Dispersion. I'll talk about what happened in New York City that then resulted in another expulsion. We began leaving New York City in increasing numbers given the default of that particular city. And now we find that with the Great Recession of 2007-2009, there's another push out of Puerto Rico at levels that had not been seen since the Great Migration. Truly extraordinary levels, and what that has done to Puerto Rico, and the fact that it has been further exacerbated by Hurricane Maria, again shows the dramatic movement of Puerto Ricans. We are now represented in every state of the Union. We have, as I will show you, we have cities like Holyoke, where over 50% of the population is now Puerto Rican. And I'll show you some of the other cities in New England as well. And then I want to talk about what do we see as the future of our Puerto Rican communities in the United States, and particularly in New England, given the changes that we're seeing in demography in this part of the country. If you look at this, you will see this is Puerto Rico's population over time. And you will see even during the period of the Great Migration, even during that, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, leading into the 70s, despite the fact that many people left, the reality was that Puerto Rico kept growing. Why? There was a dramatic change occurring in Puerto Rico on the demographic side. Puerto Rico had, during the early part of the century, had a relatively low population growth because our birth rates were offset by our mortality rates. We had a lot of children in our families, but there were not a lot of them survived. So the population didn't grow, but there were changes in health that really made a difference. Infant mortality, once infant mortality started to decline in Puerto Rico, in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, etc., what we found was that the birth rates remained high. And Puerto Rico's population began to rise quite dramatically during that period of time. And the government, in the 40s and the 50s, said we have to deal with this impoverishment of our island because we have too many people. And what they did was they exported a large segment of our population. This is not a government-neutral approach. This was a policy of both the United States government and Puerto Rico to export our people to other places. And the ones that left were largely lower income individuals from the rural areas. And the truth is that it is Puerto Rican migration to the United States that fundamentally increased income levels in Puerto Rico. And that's a very important fact that we need to understand, and we need, excuse me, we need to appreciate the sacrifices of those that left the island, because those that remained on the island benefited in many respects from that change. We see in the 1970s an interesting phenomenon where people began returning during the decade of the 1970s. They were predominantly located in New York City. They were last hired, first fired when New York City went bankrupt. Puerto Ricans were concentrated in those parts of the economy that were most displaced by what happened in New York City, and they began moving out. In the 1970s, Puerto Ricans began leaving New York City for a variety of reasons. One was the housing stock was too expensive. They began moving to parts of the Northeast, to cities that were struggling. They were deindustrializing at that point, and they were struggling. The Puerto Ricans moved to those cities because they had communities in those cities, they had social capital in those cities, and housing stock was one that they could afford. Holyoke was one of the beneficiaries of that migratory route. And they began returning to Puerto Rico because, again, as part of government policy in Puerto Rico, the federal government and the local government, that given the default of New York City, the increasing unemployment in New York City, the decline in the New York City's economy, from the perspective of the policymakers, it was better to have Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico than in New York City. So what did they do? They basically began increasing the policies in Puerto Rico. Minimum wages were increased, minimum wage boards were eliminated, social transfers grew in Puerto Rico. I remember in the early 70s that food stamps were the medium of exchange. More people had food stamps than dollars. You'd exchange food stamps as if they were dollars. So the whole support structure expanded, thank you, expanded in Puerto Rico during that period of time, and migration followed it. People returned to the island and they dispersed to other parts of the United States, particularly the New England area, in many of our cities that were having economic difficulty. And then we see what's happened in the new millennium. What you are seeing by that graph, that decline in the number of Puerto Rico's population in 2010 and 2015, is what we call a demographic winter. Puerto Rico is experiencing a demographic winter, which is basically that births are not keeping pace with mortality, with death rates. More people die. When you see that number going down, generally means we do have an outflow, but it is also the case that the population is aging in Puerto Rico. The younger Puerto Ricans have been migrating, and that impacts the birth rates as well. That's not unlike what's happening in places like Maine. You're finding a demographic winter, and that has important implications for the future of Puerto Rico as well as other communities. So, here we see net immigration numbers. The volume of people as a percentage of the Puerto Rican population is at historic levels, and it remains. If you look at what's happening, and I know the Centro is putting out some new estimates as to migration in the post-Maria period, the flows of people out leaving Puerto Rico are at, if not surpassed, what we saw in the Great Migration. Puerto Rico is losing people at a significant rate that has serious implications both for the island as well as for the receiving communities like Holyoke and Springfield and other cities. Meanwhile, the numbers of Puerto Ricans in the United States, both arriving, new arrivals, previous arrivals, and births, continues to rise. We've now easily surpassed 5 million, and we are growing. Part of it is that our population, on average, is a bit younger than the average U.S. population, and therefore our birth rates are still a bit higher. They're going down, but they are still higher than average. So we are growing as communities in the United States. Where have we been moving to? Well, this gives you particularly the cities, and this is data as of 2000, so those numbers are low. And these are the ones that have over 20% Puerto Rican population. Those numbers have changed. Holyoke is over 50%. Hartford is close to 50%. Springfield is 50%. Those numbers have been increasing at dramatic rates. We are now in cities, we have cities in New England that are now Puerto Rican majority. It's an important change. Has that translated into political representation? I was going to say I'll leave it to the political scientists to do that. I didn't realize we had so many political scientists here. It has not. It has not. At all levels. At the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. We are still, in terms of political representation, pretty much an invisible community. But these are the cities that we've been moving to. And I'll leave Florida out of that because Florida is sort of a whole different phenomenon. But in our cities in New England that really do need people, and I'll talk about that, Puerto Ricans are increasingly an important and a crucial population as well. So, there's a quote from a book that I did with my good friend, my dear friend, Edna Costa-Belén. And we talked about the resiliency of a population that is moving largely because circumstances, often beyond the control of the individual, are changing our decisions about whether to move or not. And as an economist, we talk about the individual decision of somebody is determining are they better off moving or leaving or staying or going back. But there are other outside forces that are impacting those particular decisions. And the first quote was from a book that I did with Francisco Rivera Batiz in 1994. And that book, which was called A Changing Reality, tested the assumption after 1980 that Puerto Ricans were not on the path of the typical immigrant populations. That Puerto Ricans were somehow different from Philippine community that may have been coming to the United States or some other community. That we were not reflective of the immigrant push. And we were referred to as an underclass. You remember when, there may be sociologists here, urban underclass. Yes. A whole group of people were defined as an urban underclass. And there were issues like that actually gave rise to the creation of the Puerto Rican Studies Association, which Edwin and I were very much involved in, and a number of others were as well. That basically said our reality has to be looked at differently. So, the first quote came from a book, that book that came out in 1994, which looked at the data in 1990 and said, wait a minute, that perception of Puerto Ricans as not following kind of the immigrant dream is not true. Despite how New York City's default had impacted our communities, we were coming back. We were creating a middle class. It was largely through the vehicle of education. More Puerto Ricans were getting associate's degrees than before. They were becoming nurses and firemen and a whole series of other occupations. Where manufacturing, we had been at the top. The highest percentage of an ethnic group was in manufacturing. We had at one point 30 to 40%. And that was decimated. But we were coming back as in terms of income levels. I'm not saying that that there was no poverty. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that where others felt that we were not a people that aspired to that immigrant dream, we did. And our community showed it. When given a chance, they began to prosper, and the middle class began to emerge as well. And I cite the book by Melendez and Vargas Ramos because they, writing quite a while, what was that, a number of years afterwards, came to the same conclusion, that one of the things that we can say, we can debate whether the rate of change is this or the rate of change is that. The one thing I think all of us that work in the field of Puerto Rican studies can agree to is that this is a very resilient community. Hardship, we've known hardship. We travel, we move, we adjust, we survive. And we're resilient. And we're here, and we're here to stay, and we're there, and we're there to stay. So, this is the reality.
Deal with it.
What?
Deal with it.
Let me put another item on the table, because I want to go from our experience as Puerto Ricans to a broader New England strategy. And I've got data on education, which this is, I mean, the changes that have happened in our community around education are really important. If you look at the data in 1970, we had 3/4 of our population in the United States didn't have a high school degree. Do you know what that means? 3/4 with no high school degree. Today, or closer to today, it's down to 21%. Education has been the key motivator and path for Puerto Rican both empowerment as well as economic success. And we have to keep that in mind. So, Massachusetts, the education state. Let's talk about the education state. High school graduation, highest high school graduation rates in the country. 88% of our students graduate from high school. It's not as pretty as it looks. Let me explain. It's a good statistic. But college enrollment, we are the top. Among all the states, we send more students to college than any other state in the union. Public college graduation, we're near the top. We're not at the top, but we're near the top. And the big number that all the states look at is overall college attainment. Let me define that. That's the percentage of the population in a state that has a post-secondary credential. Could be an associate's degree, could be a bachelor's degree, could be more than that. But they have some credential. And if you know, the Lumina Foundation, which just finished doing a site visit in Massachusetts, basically said the nation needs to get to 60%. And some states like Tennessee have the drive to 55 and other things like that. Massachusetts is at 60% already. We are the most educated state in the nation. The most educated state in the nation. Massachusetts residents are very proud of that. But when you look at that data by race and ethnicity, what you find is that a whole lot of folks in Massachusetts have been falling through the cracks for years now. And that's what I want to get into. These are the gaps that we see among those indicators that we have there. These are gaps by ethnicity. And this is predominantly Latinx, or Latino males in particular, for the blue. And the yellow are white females. If you are a white female in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the likelihood of your having a bachelor's degree, 65% of you will have bachelor's degrees. If you are a Latino male in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the likelihood is that 22% of you will have a bachelor's degree. That means that we have a 43 percentage point gap. All of our citizens are not benefiting from the education state. Many are falling behind, and we know who's falling behind. There's two dimensions. Two dimensions. I know, it's a little controversial, but I'll say it. Race is one. The zip code you were born into is another. Race and geography. And some people, when I go to Western Massachusetts, which is not quite as diverse as the eastern part of the state, they'll say, socioeconomic status. The data show. There are gaps with socioeconomic status, but they're nowhere near the gaps based on race. In fact, if you are a white student with low income, you are outperforming in terms of graduation rates, African American or Latinx student from a family of higher income. We are seeing gaps that are basically race dominated. So, the gaps are getting larger in many respects, not getting smaller. So we've got some outcomes. A lot of people are being left behind. A lot of students are being left behind in Massachusetts. But there's something else that makes it even more pressing that we address these changes, and that's the demography in New England. The numbers of white, largely white, traditional age, high school students going to college is going down. And it's going to be going down for a long time. If you look at the Great Recession 2007, 2009, and you look what happened to birth rates, particularly in New England, but across the country, birth rates hit 30-year lows. Birth rates, particularly in the white population, have gone down and will continue to go down. And we're seeing it in institutions like this, because I don't have to tell President Royal, she tells me. Enrollments are moving down. Across, one of the responsibilities we have is closures of institutions, higher education institutions. And what's happening to both independent institutions is that they're closing. Many of them don't. Their enrollments have gone down, the smallest ones. You've all heard of Mount Ida, but here, closer to home, you've seen what's happened to Hampshire College. Our public institutions are struggling for enrollment, particularly the community colleges, because community college enrollment is countercyclical. When the economy is booming, as it is in Massachusetts, their students say, I'm not going to study, I'm going to get a job. And that's a struggle. Some people will say, all we need to build enrollments is a really good recession. Enrollments in community colleges at least will rise. But it's not only the decline in the traditional age college-going population, it's the change in demography. It's the change in the demographic composition of that group. From 2002 to 2032, we predict that the white high school to college graduating population is going to go from its current, that's 81%, to closer to 56%. But there is growth. Latinx population in particular going from 6% to nearly a quarter. 1 in 4 students going to college, potentially going to college from our high schools, is going to be Latinx in the not too distant future. And what I tell our institutions, are you ready for that? I go, you had mentioned you were a graduate of Worcester State, right?
Yeah.
I gave a presentation to 300 faculty and staff at Worcester State. And I talked about this, and I did a sweeping hand motion into the largely white audience. And I said, are you prepared for the fact that the students that are going to be coming to your institution not only don't look like you, but their life experiences have not been quite like yours? Are you prepared to educate? Because educate you need. You need to educate these students, because in fact, Massachusetts is a state that relies on brain and not brawn. We're the most innovative state. California will say they're the most, and we always argue, among the most innovative states that relies on brain, it relies on education. It relies on institutions like Holyoke Community College and Springfield Community College are giving their students for the state to move forward. That's a reality that's facing Massachusetts. We always say, well, at least we're not Maine. Maine is really struggling. How many of you driven on the expressways where they have the sign, go to the University of Maine at in-state tuition rates compared to UMass? There's a lot of competition for students as well. So, there is an economic imperative for us to look at equity in Massachusetts. An economic imperative because this state is not going to progress and our high standard of living is going to fall if we do not begin to help those students that are now becoming an increasing percentage of our student body succeed. If we continue to let them fall through the cracks, let me give you one example. That great killer of student dreams, we call it remediation. We will probably get rid of this year active license. It's a test that kills students. If you look at Massachusetts, when I arrived in 2013, one among the first pieces of data I looked at is I looked at the data at the numbers of students in community colleges, in our 15 community colleges that needed to remediate. And the number was over 12,000. 12,000 students that get a high school degree, go to college thinking they're ready for college, because this is the education state after all. So they think they're ready for college and they show up the first day of class and they said, you take this exam, and they don't know what the exam is all about, they're not prepared for it. You know, the truth is many of us, myself included, don't really do well on those sort of standardized exams. And they fail the exam. And then they are put into a remedial class. A class that does not count for credits, you have to pay for it, and their financial aid is used for that and limited. They then take they take the first course and they're asked to do a second course. And then a third course. By the time they get to that third course, they're gone. They're gone. So of those 12,000 students that needed to remediate in the Commonwealth in our community colleges, less than 2,000 actually passed a credit-bearing course in mathematics. So we were losing 9,000 students annually. We have a shortage of workers in the Commonwealth of about 60,000 workers a year. 60,000. And partly because there are fewer high school students going to college, because there are fewer of them, but it's also, we have 600,000 people. The percentage of Massachusetts population that is 60 and older is going up by 86%. Folks are getting old. I hate to say it. I'm a participant in that terrible statistic. We are living longer, but we are getting older, and a higher percentage of our population is now older than ever before. But this is also a social imperative. It's an economic imperative, which is, I think, important to state, but I don't think we should understate the fact that it's a social imperative. This country is at the highest level of inequality that we have seen in at least 50 years. Do you think that's what's happening to this democracy is not tied to what's happening with inequality in this country? Education is the great transformer. When we were at our highest level of equality in this country is between 1943 and 1979. And if anyone looks at those numbers, those dates, they'll say 43 was when the GI Bill came about. When we began to democratize higher education by opening it up to all those veterans. And it continued. And it stopped in 1979. 1943 to 79 are called the golden years of public higher education in this nation. That's when our great systems were built. And most of us that have, my first year in the academy was 1980. So my timing was terrible. And I've seen the decline. At every institution I've seen it, and I know Edwin has seen it. We've all seen the decline in public higher education, which was the great equalizer. So, one of the things we did in Massachusetts, our Board of Higher Education has now decided that equity is its top priority. And they put a statement, and this is the vision statement that the Board of Higher Education in Massachusetts has adopted, and that the bold part in the middle says, our goal is to significantly raise the enrollment, attainment, and long-term success outcomes among underrepresented student populations. This is the primary goal of Massachusetts public higher education. This is where we are today. We are at a point, kind of a crucial crossroads, where if Massachusetts is going to continue to flourish, if these communities like Holyoke, like Springfield, are going to succeed and flourish in this very dynamic innovation kind of economy, we have to get more students through our system. People ask me, well, what does that take? I say it takes money. We have to make it affordable, but it's not only about affordability. It's not just about money. Our institutions, and I say this to my colleague, my presidents have heard this, the faculty and staff are increasingly hearing it, and boards as well. We have to look at students differently. We have to quit blaming students for their lack of success. That may sound like a... When a student fails, the institutions don't say, wow, it's our fault. They say it's your fault. You didn't get over that bar, a bar that they set. So what we do say is stop blaming the students and start looking at in the mirror. Look at your institutions. Look at the support or lack of support that they're getting. I have to tell you, I'm very, very appreciative of this institution and proud of what Holyoke Community College has done. I'm blessed to have a cadre of presidents who get it. I still have to do work in other areas, but they get it. And that's important for this community. If Holyoke Community College does not succeed, this community does not succeed. 2/3 of our students of color go where? They go to Massachusetts Community College. So, and of all the segments that we have UMass, we have our state universities, and we have our community colleges, and you know what I'm going to say next. Of all the segments that we have, what's the least well-funded? On a per-student basis, the least well-funded. So there's a lot to do. Support services, we have to, I'll toss one last statistic, and I know I'm way over time. We had this visit, Lumina Foundation came in because they wanted to know, they're hearing things about equity in Massachusetts, and they have a program, the TIE states, Talent, Innovation, and Equity. And there are 3 other TIE states, Colorado, Tennessee, and Oregon. And we're saying Massachusetts needs to be among those states, so they came in to visit. But in the course of the conversation, I asked people, I said, do you know what is the best indicator of whether a student will go to college, succeed in college, and get a degree? What's the best thing we can look at?
The education of the mother?
Have you been at other?
I don't know if I've heard that.
It is. It's if the mother.
I wonder why, right?
Yeah. That's right. If the mother has a college degree, the children, males and females, will get college degrees. Why is that? Because the mother is largely the transmitter of knowledge about how to navigate a very difficult college system. Interestingly enough, it's not the father's degree, it's the mother's degree. Because mothers have always taken on that particular responsibility. So, I'm going to stop here. You tell me, I can sit down.
It's yours.